for 30 mins. Why is this dealer taking a piss? I've been standing here, I need my things. I'm outside Petrol Home trying to find my dealer. He's in a Vauxhall Zafira, custom rims and a half a litre engine, but I just keep forgetting. I kinda wanna bell him, but I've already belled him. He gets annoyed with how much I bell him. I just wanna tell him, what is the ETA? I've been here pretending to be on my phone. I got zero data, I'm scrolling notes. Pets are home, but they don't let pets in. I've spent 15 minutes on settings. I'm in the Nelm just looking at bedding for a single bed that I rent in Epping. I'm dreading for him to come, but don't wanna text him. Why is this dealer taking a piss? I've been standing here for 30 mins. Why is this dealer taking a piss? I've been standing here, I need my things. Where's this guy, man? Let's Lewis, should I mention dangerous driving? I think I'll just remind him. He almost killed the guy behind him, but he sells things that I need buying. He said sorry to keep you waiting, I understand that it's raining. I said no need to explain it, I know that your job is draining. He said nah man, I'm not complaining, I've been sat at home just gaming. The new God of War's amazing, and I've been dabbling in. Why is this dealer taking a piss? I've been standing here for 30 mins. Why is this dealer taking a piss? I've been standing here, I need my things. Why is this dealer taking a piss? I've been standing here for 30 mins. Why is this dealer taking a piss? I've been standing here, I need my things.
One evening in April of 2006, a person sat at their kitchen table, frantically cutting up the page of a newspaper with some scissors. They were working on a very important project, and it was almost done. They finished cutting up the final letter from the page and pasted it onto the sheet of paper. Then they leaned back to read the message that they'd assembled from the scraps. It was a warning. They were sure it would have exactly the effect they were hoping for. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, please rent a huge billboard on the side of the highway and just cover it in embarrassing photos of the following. Okay, let's get into today's story. On Sunday afternoon, March 12, 2006, 39-year-old Michael Zamidi Jr. drove his ATV across a frozen lake in Freedom, New Hampshire. And even though it was really cold and the air burned his cheeks and his lungs, Mike smiled as he drove. He really just loved it here. Most of the time, Mike lived 2 hours away in the town of Wakefield, Massachusetts. But he'd been coming to Freedom, New Hampshire for years because his parents had a vacation house here. And so this tiny lakeside community had always felt like a second home and a peaceful retreat. And Mike had recently bought his own vacation house in Freedom, just down the street from his parents. And the purchase had been a really big deal for him. He ran a cement contracting company called Allstate Concrete Pumping, and he'd worked really hard for many years to build up a nice life for his wife Michelle and their 3 kids. And in many ways, the purchase of the second house was proof that he'd done it. But his work with the concrete company had also created some issues in his marriage. Being in charge of a company meant a lot of responsibility and long hours. So Michelle and the kids were on their own quite a bit, which meant Michelle had to do most of the parenting and most of the household stuff. And she'd recently made it clear that Mike being gone all the time, despite how successful he was still really hard for him. Now, out on the lake, as Mike was kind of thinking about his whole life, Mike could see another ATV coming toward him. And as it got closer, he could see that the driver of the ATV was the other problem in his marriage, Sean Fitzpatrick. So, Sean was one of their neighbors on the lake, and he'd been a close friend of the family for years. He was retired, and he lived in freedom year-round, and when the Zmitties were there, he'd come over for dinners or barbecues or to take their kids boating out on the lake. He was around so much that Mike's kids actually called him Uncle Sean. But last summer, Mike had found out that his wife Michelle had cheated on him with Sean. Mike had been obviously completely devastated, but he and Michelle had both agreed not to give up on their marriage and had been going to therapy together ever since. And in terms of Mike and Sean's relationship, well, Mike still hadn't actually spoken to Sean since finding out about the affair, because mostly he just hated confrontation. It had been easier for him to avoid Sean and focus on rebuilding his relationship with Michelle. So seeing Sean now made Mike want to just turn around and speed off in the other direction. But Mike could see that Sean was already waving him down, so he came to a stop and waited there as Sean pulled his ATV out. And Sean did not beat around the bush. He immediately told Mike that he was glad he ran into him here because he'd been wanting to apologize about last summer and Michelle. It obviously wasn't okay, and he hoped they could just, put it behind them. And Mike, he was so surprised by how sincere Sean was being that he just said, you know what, that's all good. Which he didn't mean, because it definitely was not okay. But again, Mike's not a confrontational guy. All Mike really wanted to do here was get out of this interaction and get away from Sean, because this made him really uncomfortable. And also, he genuinely did need to leave, basically right now, because he and Michelle and the kids were getting ready to head back to Wakefield soon. He wanted to go help Michelle pack up. And so pretty quickly, Mike told Sean that he really had to go here. And then before, Sean could protest, Mike turned his ATV around and he gunned it back across the lake towards his house. About 15 minutes later, Mike walked into his house, and the first thing he saw was a bunch of suitcases all packed and sitting by the door. And he realized that, Michelle had already done all the work. But seconds later, Michelle came in and gave Mike a kiss. And she said, the kids were just finishing up cleaning their rooms and they could all head out in a few minutes. And then Mike heard the sound of a car beeping twice outside. And when he and his wife heard that, Michelle kind of rolled her eyes and laughed, because they both knew it was clearly Mike's parents. His parents had also been in freedom for this weekend at their house down the street, and they were also making a 2-hour drive back to Wakefield this afternoon. And Michelle was laughing because it amused her that neither Mike nor his father could manage to go a single day without talking to each other. So Mike's dad was also named Michael, and the name was not the only thing they shared. They were also best friends and co-workers. Michael Sr. owned the company that Mike ran, Allstate Concrete. So it was like a family operation, and Mike Jr. had never even thought of doing anything else. He jumped into the concrete business right out of high school, and he and his dad had been working together ever since. Now, the Allstate Concrete Company had some struggles, just like any company would, including a lawsuit from a former employee that had been pretty stressful. But for the most part, the business was a huge success, and right now they were busier than ever, working on an enormous construction project in nearby Boston. So Mike headed outside to say hi to his parents and to talk a little business with his dad. He asked Mike Sr. if he'd called their employee, Chester Roberts, yet, because Mike and his dad had plans to be at the office first thing tomorrow morning, and Mike wanted Chester to be there too. Chester worked part-time for them as a driver and also handyman, and he was easily the most reliable employee that they had. So whenever they had a packed week ahead, they always called Chester in. And to Mike Jr.'s relief, Mike Sr. said yes, he'd already spoken to Chester, and they were good to go. So eventually, they all said their goodbyes, and Mike Jr. told his dad he would see him tomorrow. Just before 8 a.m. the next morning, Monday, March 13th, Mike Jr. pulled his truck into the parking lot of Allstate Concrete. He was right on time. He could see he was the first vehicle there, so he got out and hustled across the lot because it was raining, and he unlocked a side door by one of the garage doors. So the Allstate building was basically just a massive garage with 3 huge roll-up doors for their cement trucks to pull into. But it also had an upstairs office where Mike and his father did all their administrative work. So after Mike went in through the side door into the big garage, he headed up a set of steps that led to his office on the 2nd level. And when he got there, he sat in his desk chair and started going over the week's logistics. And just a few minutes later, he heard another vehicle pull into the lot outside. Mike figured that very likely this was his father, because Chester often came to the office on foot. Then Mike Jr. heard the downstairs door open and footsteps coming up the stairs. A few minutes later, Mike's father, Mike Sr., pulled his truck into the Allstate concrete parking lot and parked next to his son's truck. He hopped out and walked quickly to the building's side door to get out of the rain, but when he tried to push open the side door, it got stuck on something and wouldn't open all the way. So he looked through the crack to see what was blocking the door, and he froze, because there was clearly a man lying face down inside of the building in a huge pool of blood. Now, it was dark inside the building, and so Michael Sr. could not see the man's face. He had no idea who this guy was. But whoever it was, he knew sort of instinctively that it was not his son. Mike Jr. was a big guy, and even in the dark, it was clear this man had a different build. And so Michael Sr.'s heart was pounding now, and all he could think to do was just back away, grab his cell phone, and call 911. However, after Michael Sr. got off the phone with the dispatcher and they said they were sending people over now, Mike Sr. realized he couldn't just wait for the police to get there. I mean, there was clearly someone either very badly hurt or dead in his garage, and his son was likely somewhere inside too. I mean, his truck was here. And so he had to go in and make sure his son was okay. So Michael Sr. walked away from the blocked door where he had been standing when he called the police, and he pulled up one of the big roll-up garage doors. And once it was open, he didn't see anyone. He just ran inside and began frantically screaming his son's name. But Mike Jr. didn't answer, and there was no sign of him anywhere. So eventually, Mike Sr. ran to the staircase and went up to the second-floor office. And as soon as Mike Sr. barged into the office, he stopped in horror, because there, sitting slumped in the desk chair, was the blood-covered body of his son. Over an hour later, Massachusetts State Trooper Kevin Baker pulled up in front of Allstate Concrete. He could see the large building was already roped off with caution tape, and there were a dozen or more crime scene techs and officers with the Wakefield Police Department who were moving in and out of an open garage door collecting evidence. So Baker was not a part of the Wakefield Police Department. He was with the state police. But in Massachusetts, state troopers conduct homicide investigations right alongside local authorities. Baker had a feeling that this case would definitely need his help, because Wakefield, they didn't get many homicides. The town was about 10 miles north of Boston and had a reputation as being a really peaceful and safe place, the kind of small town where everyone actually knew each other. Baker got out of his cruiser and looked around for whoever was in charge. And he didn't have to wait long, because an officer hurried up to him and introduced himself as Detective Richard Cass with the Wakefield Police Department. Cass told Baker to follow him, and as they walked towards the open garage door, he quickly briefed Baker up on the situation. There were 2 male victims inside, and both were deceased. They'd both been shot, and they had been found by the company's owner. Mike was in at the scene a little after 8 a.m. Baker followed Cass into the garage and over to the first body, which was face down on the floor just inside a smaller side door. Cass explained that this victim was 51-year-old Chester Roberts, a part-time truck driver for Allstate. It hadn't been difficult to identify him because Chester did a lot of handiwork around town and was known by all the locals, including Detective Cass himself. When Baker went to the body, he could tell right away that Chester had been shot in the back. It was a single shot, and most likely was from a shotgun, since clearly there was a blast radius where there was like a spray effect with a lot of little pellets that entered his body. Chester had no other visible injuries, including no defensive injuries. And when Baker stood and looked around the garage, he also didn't see anything that pointed to a robbery or any kind of struggle. There was pretty pricey looking equipment just sitting around, and nothing was toppled over or obviously out of place. So Baker guessed that Chester's killer had likely snuck up on him and shot him in the back before he even had a chance to turn around. Baker spent a couple more minutes looking around at the doors and windows, and again, didn't see any signs of forced entry or anything out of the ordinary, but that didn't mean much. Chester had likely opened up for the day and begun work, and the killer had just come in after him. And so after a few minutes, when Baker was done looking around the first floor, he told Cass he was ready to go up to the second floor to see the second body. Moments later, Cass led Baker into the second floor office, where the body of 39-year-old Mike Zimetti Jr. had been found. Detective Cass said sadly that, just like with Chester, he knew Mike personally as well. Mike Jr. had not just been shot in the torso the way Chester had been shot. He had been shot in the face as well as in the chest. And the force of these shots had been so powerful that, like, his desk and surrounding paperwork were also all drenched in blood. And for the most part, Mike was basically unrecognizable. But what struck Baker the most was not just how gruesome this was. It was the fact that, Mike Jr. is still kind of slumped in his chair, was in his office. Whoever did this, it's like they went in here to execute Mike, really intentionally. They marched in here, they didn't touch anything else, and they shot Mike right in the face with a shotgun before Mike could even get up. I mean, this seemed very intentional. Somebody came here to kill Mike. And so as Baker was thinking about that, he realized that this likely meant Mike Jr. was the one who actually got shot first, before Chester had even arrived at the building. Otherwise, Mike Jr. would have heard the gunshot downstairs, and he wouldn't have been so caught off guard sitting in his chair like this. And so again, if Mike was the first person shot, it just further suggested that he was the main target of this attack. The crime scene, of course was gruesome, but considering it was remarkably clean. I mean, there were no bloody footprints or any indication the killer had interacted with the scene. And the Zamitis did fit the mafia stereotype, an Italian-American family involved in construction. Baker told Cass what he was thinking, sort of as he was surveying the scene here. And Cass, as he heard this, he sort of had this thoughtful look come over his face. He said he knew the Zamitis pretty well, and Mike Jr. and his father were really good people. So he found it hard to believe they were involved in any kind of shady, mafia business deals. But he conceded that it was possible, especially since the Zamitis were contractors on a project called the Big Dig. This made Baker immediately raise his eyebrows. So the Big Dig was literally the biggest construction project in the country and involved building a tunnel under the harbor in Boston. But it had been kind of like a total disaster, just a major headache for the city since it was way over budget and had been going on for 15 years and still wasn't done. This huge project had also been famously hampered by mafia dealings and corrupt payoffs. So now Baker had to wonder if the Zamitis had either been involved in these seedy deals or had maybe accidentally upset the wrong person while on the job. But even if the murders had nothing to do with the mob, Baker still thought it was very likely that the killer was somehow connected to their business. Somebody who maybe had worked at Allstate Concrete, or maybe who had been a client, and would know where Mike worked in the building, and that he'd be there early in the morning. And while the second victim, Chester, was probably not the primary target, Baker wasn't sure yet why he was also killed. He could have been killed because he was just at work at the wrong moment, or maybe he was wrapped up in the same conflict as the Zamitis. So for a moment, Baker just stood there staring at the scene, staring at the blood-soaked paperwork all over the desk. And then eventually he turned to Cass and said they would need a list of all of Allstate's employees and clients. Baker then spent some more time just kind of walking around the office looking for evidence. And he noticed a 16-gauge shotgun shell on the floor. So he grabbed a nearby tech, he told her to bag it and see if she could locate any other shells. Baker and Cass then headed outside, where already a crowd of people were gathering outside around the outside of the police perimeter. Once they were outside, Trooper Baker asked Cass if they could start by speaking with the person who actually discovered the bodies, Michael Zameti Sr. But Detective Cass shook his head and said no. He explained when he'd first gotten to the scene that Michael Sr. had been so distraught over his son's death that he could barely speak, so Cass had just sent him home. Another Wakefield police officer had done the same thing when Mike Jr.'s wife, Michelle Zameti, showed up, totally hysterical, saying she had heard there was an accident. And they told her that her husband was dead and taken her home too. Baker understood, but was not thrilled to hear this. He preferred to speak to witnesses and family really quickly and in person. Murder, a spouse is always a suspect, so he was especially disappointed to have missed Michelle. But there was still plenty to do at the scene. And obviously, the Wakefield police knew where the family had been found later. So Baker turned to Cass and suggested they just start canvassing the businesses nearby. The following morning, March 14th, Trooper Baker parked his car in front of Mike's parents' house in Wakefield. He was with Detective Cass, and they were there to speak with Mike Sr. They'd just gotten the autopsies back for both Chester and Mike, but they didn't reveal anything that they didn't already know. Chester had been shot once, Mike twice, and both died likely within seconds. But the investigators did have one potential lead from their canvass of the neighborhood. Even though they hadn't found any surveillance cameras at Allstate Concrete, Some businesses around Allstate had some. So Baker had some officers scrubbing through that footage now. He also had another team interviewing Chester Roberts' family, because there was still a chance that Baker had gotten this all wrong and maybe Chester was actually the target. Besides that, the crime techs had not found much physical evidence at the scene. There were no fingerprints, and since it had been raining, they hadn't been able to collect any footprints or car tracks from outside. So now, Baker reached up and knocked on the front door of the Smitty's house, hoping that Mike Sr. would be able to point them in the right direction. A minute later, Baker and Cass sat in the living room with Mike Sr. and Pat, Mike's mom. Both of Mike's parents seemed incredibly emotional. Michael Sr. was visibly shaking, while Pat just cried. And seeing how upset they were now made Baker realize that Cass had made the right call in sending Michael Sr. home yesterday. Even 24 hours later, it was still going to be very hard to get any sort of real answer out of them because of how upset they were. So Baker decided he would just have to keep it really brief. The first thing he did is he asked Mike Sr. to just go over the actual discovery of the bodies. Tell me what happened. And what he said lined up with everything that Baker had heard from Cass and from dispatch. And so after Mike Sr. went over that, Baker moved on to the real reason he was there. He asked if there was anybody in Mike Jr.'s life who might have wanted to hurt him. Mike Sr. took a few shaky breaths as he thought about the question. And then he said that, there were a few people in the industry that he and his son did not necessarily get along with, but mostly they tried to have good relationships with everyone. I mean, getting in fights was just bad business. But as he was saying this, Mike Sr. suddenly sat up straighter, like he just thought of something. And he said, actually, there was a former coworker who did definitely have a grudge against them. His nephew, Hank Jennings. Hank got mad at them a few years ago about unpaid overtime wages and actually filed a lawsuit against them. Now, they'd eventually paid Hank a settlement. They still all hated each other. Mike Sr. looked over at his wife, Pat. She just nodded and said the whole thing had been really high stress and very volatile. Baker took down Hank's information and talked with Mike's parents for just a few more minutes. And then he nodded to Cass, and they stood to leave. Baker knew he still needed to speak more to the Smitty's, but for now, he was going to give them a break. And instead, he and Cass would look into Hank. 2 days later, Baker sat in Cass's office at the Wakefield Police Department, poring over crime scene photos and witness statements. He was starting to get antsy. After meeting with Mike's parents, he'd been excited to speak with Hank Jennings, the disgruntled former employee who also happened to be Mike's cousin. But even though Baker and Cass had sent officers out to track Hank down for an interview, they hadn't been able to get a hold of him yet. However, they had gotten in touch with Mike's wife, Michelle, and had questioned her at her house in Wakefield, but she hadn't given them much. She said that she was at home with her kids at the time of her husband's death, and that she really didn't know of anybody who would want to hurt Mike Jr. Also, Baker and Cass had looked into Allstate Concrete's financial statements, and they had found nothing that suggested there was anything shady or mafia-related happening with the company. Still, Baker knew they were better off than they had been a few days ago, primarily because they had had a chance to review a bunch of the surveillance footage from the businesses around Allstate. And one of those security cameras had been aimed at the street right outside Allstate. Now, this angle didn't show the Allstate parking lot itself, but it did show everyone who entered and exited that parking lot from the street. So, this particular camera had picked up Mike Jr.'s truck arriving at work at 7:39 a.m., and then at 7:44 a.m., so 5 minutes later, an unknown green pickup truck pulled in as well. And then a few minutes after that, Chester Roberts was seen arriving at Allstate on foot. And then at 7:50, the green truck was seen again, leaving the parking lot, 12 minutes before Michael Sr.'s red truck arrived with a victim. So, whoever the killer was, it looked like they had driven that green truck and had killed Mike and Chester between 7:44 a.m. and 7:50 a.m. The video wasn't clear enough to show the driver of this mysterious green truck or even see its plates. And it didn't actually show the driver of this vehicle, the killer, getting out of the vehicle and entering the building. But knowing the style and color of very likely the killer's vehicle would definitely help them narrow down potential suspects. Just then, the desk phone rang, and Baker watched as Cass grabbed it and said hello. And then Cass got a confused look on his face before he thanked the caller and said they'd be right over. He hung up and told Baker that was Michelle Zametti, and she'd called to say that she had new information to give them, something that she hadn't mentioned in her first interview, and that it was really important. About 15 minutes later, Baker and Cass sat down across from Michelle in her living room for the second time. And to Baker, Michelle seemed very different from the last time they spoke. 2 days ago, she'd seemed horrified and grief-stricken. But now, she just seemed really nervous. She kept touching her hair and fiddling with a stack of condolence cards on the coffee table. Baker commented that there were a lot of cards, and Michelle just nodded. She said, so many people had reached out and sent cards, all their friends and neighbors in Wakefield and in Freedom, New Hampshire, where their second home was. And then Michelle took a breath and just got straight to the reason that she'd called them. She said that she'd withheld information about one of her neighbors in Freedom. His name was Sean Fitzpatrick, and she'd had an affair with him. Baker cleared his throat in surprise and then asked her to go on. Michelle's eyes filled with tears as she explained how Mike Jr. worked so much, and she and the kids spent a lot of time at their lake house. And so that meant they spent a lot of time with Sean. And eventually this friendship between Michelle and Sean had grown into a romance. Baker couldn't believe he was hearing this. A secret love triangle gave both Sean